is there's no universal agreed upon definition for this. In the same way that we've struggled to come up with a universal definition for what it is to know something, or a universal definition for what anxiety is, for example, in psychology is another really good example. There are a lot of ways to kind of like gesture at what AI is, but really it's like, obviously, or maybe not obviously, AI stands for artificial intelligence. And the AI's project is to build a computer that can think and learn in the same way that humans learn. And because of the way that computers work, for a very long time, that was a really hard problem. AI started as a field in the 50s at Dartmouth. And you can like actually look at the original paper. They were very optimistic. They were like, maybe like, a summer's worth of work and we'll have nailed this. And the way that they defined it is to be able to reduce down human intelligence into a system of symbols that they could combine together based on explicit rules that would mimic human intelligence. And so there's a really clear through line from Socrates' original project to the Enlightenment to the original approach that AI theorists took called symbolic AI. The idea that you could embody thinking in essentially like logical symbols and transformations between logical symbols, it's very similar to just basic philosophy. And there are actually a lot of early successes. For example, the two founding fathers of AI, Herbert Simon and Alan Newell, built this machine that they called the general problem solver. And what's really interesting is it wasn't even built as a computer, because computers were extremely expensive back then. They originally codified the general problem solver on paper and then executed it themselves by hand. Actually, I think one of them had their family do it with them to try to simulate how a computer would work to solve complex problems. And the general problem solver, they tried to reduce down, complex real world situations into simple logic problems that look a little bit like games. And then they tried to see if they could build a computer that would solve some of those games. And they were actually quite successful at first. What they found was it worked really well for simple problems. But as problems got more and more complex, the search space of possible solutions got really, 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 really big. And so by representing the problem in that way, the systems that they built started to fail as soon as they moved away from toy problems to more complex ones. I think a really interesting and simple example of this is thinking about how you might decide whether an email in your inbox is spam or whether it's important. And you might say something like, if it mentions that I won the lottery, it's spam, right? And so that sort of like if-then rule is a lot like the kinds of rules that early symbolic AI theorists were trying to come up with to help you solve any problem, is to codify like, if XYZ is true, then here are the implications. What happens is if you look at that really closely, there are always lots of little exceptions. So an example might be if it says emergency, maybe you want to put that at the top of your inbox. But very quickly, you'll have spammers obviously being like, just put emergency in the subject line and they'll shoot to the top. So then you have to kind of like create another rule, which is it's emergency, but only if it's from my coworkers or my family. But computers don't really know what coworkers or family is. So then you have to define, okay, like how is it going to know what a coworkers or what a family member is? So what you can do is maybe it's like a coworker is anybody from my company. And so if it says emergency and it's from anybody in my company, put it at the top of my inbox. But what you may find is that there are certain people at your company who are annoying and want your attention, even if you don't really want them to contact you. And so they start putting emergency into their inbox. And now you have to create another rule, which is like, don't let people who are abusing the privilege of getting to the top of my inbox abuse it, even if they're coworkers. And what you find is anytime you try to create rules to define these things, you always run up against exceptions. If you want to, for example, define what an important email is, you have to define pretty much everything about the world. You have to create a world full of definitions. And that project of making the entire world explicit in definitions just didn't work. It's too brittle. It's too hard. There's too much computational power required to loop through all the different definitions to decide, if this email is important or not. And it's just, there are too many definitions to create. It's too big of a project. And so that symbolic AI project worked in some limited domains. And there were these things called expert systems, for example, in the 70s and 80s that tried to, for example, reduce medical diagnosis down to a set of rules. And they were somewhat successful. But even in a case like medical diagnosis, trying to reduce down to a simple set of rules, something like, do you have measles, or maybe even do you have anxiety or depression, turned out to be really complicated and really, really hard. And in fact, impossible to get right 100% of the time in an explicit way. The alternative, which originated around the time that AI itself originated, but really wasn't taken that seriously until probably the 80s and 90s, is what's called a neural network. And a neural network, it is inspired by the way our brains work. It doesn't work exactly the same way, but it's inspired that way. It is inspired from brains. And it basically consists of layers of artificial neurons that are connected to each other. And what you can do with a neural network is you can get it to recognize patterns by giving it lots of examples. You can, for example, if you want it to recognize like whether an email is important, what you can do is you can give it an example, say like, here's an email from a coworker, and have it guess the answer. And if the answer is wrong, what we've done is we've created a way to train the network to correct its wrong answer. And what happens is over many, 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 many iterations and many, many different examples, what we find is without any explicit set of definitions or explicit rules about like, this is an important email, or this is a cat, or this is a good move in chess, the neural network learns to recognize patterns and is able to do a lot of the more complex thinking style tasks that early symbolic AI was unable to do. Language models are a particular kind of neural network that operates by finding complex patterns inside of language and using that to produce what comes next in a sequence. So what we've done with language models is fed them basically, all of the text on the internet. And when we feed them a piece of text, we'll give them, a big chunk of text. And then we will say, based on this chunk, what's the next word that comes after this chunk? And language models learn that there are many, many thousands of partially fitting rules that they can apply based on the previous history of text they've seen to predict what comes next. And all of those rules are inexplicit. They're kind of like you can observe them in the overall behavior of the network, but they don't exist anywhere in the network. You can't go and look inside of a neural network and find like this is exactly this is the entire set of rules that it has. You may be able to find a couple, but you can't find a definitive list. In the same way that if I took a microscope and looked in your brain, I would not be able to find that. I would not be able to find the list of rules that you use, for example, to recognize a cat or do the next move in chess. They're represented all inexplicitly. And what's really interesting about neural networks is the way that they think or the way that they operate is a lot like it looks a lot like human intuition. Human intuition is also trained by thousands and thousands and thousands of hours of direct experience. Often our best metaphor for our minds are the tools that we use. So a really good example is Freud has one of the most impactful models of the mind. And the way that he came up with that is he used the steam engine as a metaphor. So it's an explicitly steam engine based idea. In the 20th century, the metaphor for our minds moved into being like a computer that became the kind of thing that we all wanted to be like. We wanted to be logical and rational and operate like a machine to make the best decisions possible. And I think one of the most interesting things about that way of thinking is it makes invisible to us, and this I think relates a lot to the like sort of Socratic Enlightenment type of thinking as well. It makes invisible to us the importance of our intuition in being the foundation of everything that we do, everything we think, everything that we know. In a lot of ways, you can think of rationality as emerging out of intuition. So like we have this sort of like squishy, inexplicit, intuitive way of understanding what's going on in the world. And our rational thought comes out of that and is able to, once intuition sort of sets the frame for us, is able to go in and sort of manipulate things in a more methodical, rational, logical way. But you sort of need both. And neural networks are the first technology we've ever invented that works a lot like human intuition. And the reason I love that is because I hope that it makes more visible to us the value and importance of intuitive thought. And that actually loops back and takes us all the way back to Protagoras, and is sort of the thing that we lost in this birth of rationalism back in Callias's house, because Protagoras is arguing that everyone teaches us excellence all the time. He's using stories and myths and metaphor to help us understand something that he knows from his own personal experience. And Socrates is saying, well, if you can't define it, if you can't tell me exactly the rules by which you know something, then you don't know it. And that way of thinking about the world has been very successful for us, but it also kind of blinded us to how important that idea that everyone teaches us to be excellent, that stories and personal hands-on experience give us a way of knowing about things that we may not be able to explicitly talk about, but we still know just as much as we know.
Transmitted, how the virus
5 left. Good luck. 5. Four, three, two. Starts 4 right, 5 left. Good luck. 5, 4, 3, 2. Okay, that's a 16 minute. 6, 2.
A great start for this team. They've really hit the ground running here on their first stage. Let's see if they can carry the momentum into the next.